My name is Brandon Holler. I go to John Paul the Great Catholic High School. I'm a senior. I will be reading from Chapter 3 of Bleak House, written by Charles Dickens. And in this excerpt, Esther Summerson takes over as the narrator. She is 14 and she is talking to her godmother. The stranger from earlier on in the book reappears and introduces himself as Kenge. He reveals that Esther's godmother was actually her aunt. And they talk about the lawsuit Jarndyce and Jarndyce. It must have been 2 years afterward, and I was almost 14, when one dreadful night my godmother and I sat at the fireside. I was reading aloud and she was listening. I had come down at 9 o'clock, as I always did, to read the Bible to her, and was reading from St. John how our Savior stooped down, writing with his finger in the dust, when they brought the sinful woman to him. So, when they continued asking him, he lifted up himself and said unto them, He is that without sin among you, let him first cast a stone at her. I was stopped by my godmother's rising, putting her hand to her head, and crying out in an awful voice from quite another part of the book. Watch ye therefore, lest coming suddenly he find you sleeping. And what I say unto you, I say unto all, watch. In an instant, while she stood before me repeating these words, she fell down on the floor. I had no need to cry out. Her voice has sounded throughout the house, and been heard in the street. She was laid upon her bed. For more than a week she lay there, little altered outwardly, with her old handsome resolute frown that I so well knew, carved upon her face. Many and many a time, in the day and in the night, with my head upon the pillow by her that my whispers might be plainer to her, I kissed her, thanked her, prayed for her, asked her for her blessing and forgiveness, entreated her to give me the least sign that she knew or heard me. No, no, no. Her face was immovable. To the very last, and even afterwards, her frown remained unsoftened. On the day after my poor godmother was buried, the gentleman in black with the white neckcloth reappeared. I was sent for by Mrs. Rachel and found him in the same place, as if he had never gone away. My name is Ken, she said. You may remember it. My child, Kenjin Carboy, Lincoln's Inn. I replied that I remembered I've seen him once before. Pray be seated here, near me. Don't distress yourself, it's of no use. Mrs. Rachel, I needn't inform you were acquainted with the late Mrs. Barbary's affairs, that her means die with her, and that this young lady, now her aunt, is dead. My aunt, sir? Is it really of no use carrying on a deception when no object is to be gained by it? Said Mr. Kenge smoothly. Aunt, in fact, though not in law. Don't distress yourself. Don't weep. Don't tremble. Mrs. Rachel, our young friend, has no doubt heard of the Jarndyce and Jarndyce. Never, said Mrs. Rachel. Is it possible, pursued Mr. Kenge, putting up his eyeglasses, that a young friend, I beg you won't distress yourself, never heard of Jarndyce and Jarndyce? I shook my head, wondering even what it was. Not of Jarndyce and Jarndyce, said Mr. Kenge, looking over his glasses at me, and softly turning the case about and about as if he were petting something. Not of one of the greatest Chancery suits known, not of Jarndyce and Jarndyce, the in itself a monument of Chancery's practice, in which I would say every difficulty, every contingency, every masterly fiction, every form of procedure known in that court is represented over and over again. It is a cause that could not exist out of this free and great country. I should say that the aggregate of costs in Jarndyce and Jarndyce, Miss Rachel, I was afraid he had addressed himself to her because I appeared inattentive. Amounts at the present hour to from 60 to 70,000 pounds, said Mr. Kenge, leaning back in his chair. I felt very ignorant, but what could I do? I was so entirely unacquainted with the subject that I understood nothing about it even then. And she never heard of the cause, said Mr. Kenge. Surprising. Miss Barbary, sir, returned Miss Rachel, who is now among the seraphim. I hope so, I am sure, said Mr. Kenge politely. Wished Esther only to know what would be serviceable to her, and she knows from any teaching that she has had here, nothing more. Well, said Mr. Kenge, upon the whole very proper. Now to the point, addressing me. Miss Barbary, your sole relation, in fact that it is, for I am bound to observe that in the law you had none, being deceased and it naturally not being to be expected that Mrs. Rachel. Oh dear, no, said Miss Rachel quickly. Quite so, assented Mr. Kenge, that Mrs. Rachel should charge herself with your maintenance and support. I beg you won't distress yourself. You are in a position to receive the renewal of an offer which I was instructed to make to Miss Barbary some 2 years ago, and which, though rejected then, was understood to be renewable under the lamentable circumstances that have since occurred. Now, if I vow that I represent a Jarndyce and otherwise, a highly human, but at the same time singular man, shall I compromise myself by any stretch of my professional caution? Said Mr. Kenge, leaning back in his chair again and looking calmly at us both.